Isis Unveiled by Helena Blavatsky. This recording is on March 27th, 2025, which is Ms. Blavatsky's Mayan birthday, and she is resolving rainstorm. Chapter 1 starts with a quote, "Ergo sum qui sum," an axiom of Hermetic philosophy. Another quote, "We commenced research where modern conjecture closes its faithless wings, and with us those were the common elements of science which the sages of today disdain as wild chimeras, or despair of as unfathomable mysteries." By Bulwer's Zanoni, end quote. There exists somewhere in this wide world an old book, so very old that our modern antiquarians might ponder over its pages an indefinite time and still not quite agree as to the nature of the fabric upon which it is written. It is the only original copy now in existence. The most ancient Hebrew document on occult learning, the Sifra Zenuita, was compiled from this ancient book, and that at a time when the former was already considered in the light of a literary relic. One of its illustrations represents the divine essence emanating from Adam, like a luminous arc, proceeding to form a circle, and then, having attained the highest point of its circumference, the ineffable glory bends back in again and returns to earth, bringing a higher type of humanity in its vortex. As it approaches nearer and nearer to our planet, the emanation becomes more and more shadowy, until upon touching the ground it is as black as night. A conviction founded upon 70,000 years of experience, as they allege, has been entertained by Hermetic philosophers of all periods, that matter has in time become, through sin, more gross and dense than it was at man's first formation, that at the beginning the human body was of a half-ethereal nature, and that before the so-called fall, humankind communed freely with the now unseen universes. But since that time, matter has become a formidable barrier between us and the world of spirits. The oldest esoteric traditions also teach that, before the mystic Adam, many races of human beings lived and died out. Many races of human beings lived and died out, each giving place in its turn to the next. Were these precedent types more perfect than us? Did any of them belong to the winged race of men mentioned by Plato in Phaedrus? Is it the special province of science to solve the problem, or science fiction to show us? The caves of France and the relics of the Stone Age afford a point at which to begin. As the cycle proceeded, man's eyes were more and more opened until he came to know good versus evil, as well as the Elohim themselves. Having reached its summit, the cycle began to go downward. When the arc attained a certain point which brought it parallel with the fixed line of our terrestrial plane, the man was furnished by nature with coats of skin, and the Lord God clothed them. This same belief in the pre-existence of a far more spiritual race than the one to which we now belong can be traced back to the earliest traditions of nearly every people. In the ancient Mayan Quiche manuscript, published by Brasseur de Beaubourg, the Popol Vuh, the first men are mentioned as a race that could reason and speak, whose sight was unlimited, and who knew all things at once. According to Philo Judaeus, the air is filled with an invisible host of spirits, some of whom are free from evil and are immortal, and others who are pernicious and mortal. He says, "From the sons of El, the Elohim, we are descended, and sons of Elohim we must become again." And the unequivocal statement of the anonymous Gnostic who wrote the Gospel according to John says that, quote, "As many as received him," meaning all those who followed practically the esoteric doctrines of Yeshua would, back to the quote, "become the sons of God." So again, as many as received him, meaning everyone who followed the doctrines of Jesus, would become the sons of God. Yeshua himself said, "Know ye not ye are gods?" Plato describes admirably in Phaedrus the state in which man once was and what he will become again, before and after the loss of his wings, when he lived among the gods, a god himself in the airy world. From the remotest periods, religious philosophies taught that the whole universe was filled with divine and spiritual beings of diverse races. From one of these evolved, in the course of time, Adam, the primitive human. The Kalmucks and some tribes of Siberia also describe in their legends earlier creations than our present race. These beings, they say, were possessed of almost boundless knowledge, and in their audacity even threatened rebellion against the great chief spirit. To punish their presumption and humble them, God imprisoned them in bodies, and so shut in their senses. From these they can escape, but only through long repentance, self-purification, and development spiritually. The Siberian shamans, they think, occasionally enjoyed the divine powers originally possessed by all human beings. The Astor Library of New York City has recently been enriched by a facsimile of an Egyptian medical treatise written in the 16th century BC, or more precisely 1552 before Christ was born, which, according to the commonly received chronology, is the time when Moses was just 21 years of age. The original is written upon the inner bark of a cypress papyrus and has been pronounced by Professor Schenk of Leipzig not only genuine, but also the most perfect ever seen. This Egyptian medical treatise consists of a single sheet of yellow-brown papyrus of finest quality, 3/10 of a meter wide and more than 20 meters long, and forming one roll divided into 110 pages, all carefully numbered. It was purchased in Egypt in 1872 by the archaeologist Ebers of a well-to-do Arab family from Luxor. The New York newspaper, the Tribune, commented upon the circumstance, saying, "The papyrus bears internal evidence of being one of the 6 Hermetic books on medicine named by Clement of Alexandria." The newspaper editor further says, "At the time of Iamblichus, AD 363, the priests of Egypt showed 42 books which they attributed to Hermes, or Thoth. Of these," the editor continues, "according to that author, 36 contained the history of all human knowledge. The last 6 treated of anatomy, of pathology, of affections of the eye, instruments of surgery, and of medicine. The Papyrus Ebers is indisputably one of these ancient Hermetic works." End quote. If so clear a ray of light has been thrown upon ancient Egyptian science by the so-called accidental encounter of the German archaeologist with one well-to-do Arab from Luxor, how can we know what sunshine may be let in upon the dark crypts of history by an equally accidental meeting between some other prosperous Egyptian and another enterprising student of antiquity, for example? The discoveries of modern science do not disagree with the oldest traditions which claim an incredible antiquity for our race. Within the last few years, geology, which previously had only conceded that humanity could be traced as far back as the Tertiary period, has found unanswerable proofs that human existence antedates the last glaciation of Europe over 250,000 years humanity has tread upon the earth. A hard nut, this, for patristic theology to crack, but an accepted fact with the ancient philosophers. Moreover, fossil implements have been exhumed together with human remains, which show that man hunted in those remote times and knew how to build a fire 250,000 years ago. But the forward step has not yet been taken in this search for the origin of the race. Science comes to a dead stop and waits for future proofs. Unfortunately, anthropology and psychology possess no Cuvier. Neither geologists nor archaeologists are able to construct, from the fragmentary bits hitherto discovered, the perfect skeletons of the triple man, physical, intellectual, and spiritual. Because the fossil implements of man are found to become more rough and uncouth as geology penetrates deeper into the bowels of the earth, it seems a proof to science that the closer we come to the origin of man, the more savage and brute-like he must be. Strange logic. Does the finding of the remains in the cave of Devon prove that there were no contemporary races then who were highly civilized? When the present population of the earth have disappeared, and some archaeologist belonging to the next race of the distant future shall excavate the domestic implements of one of our Indian or Andaman Indian tribes, will he be justified in concluding that mankind in the 19th century was just emerging from the Stone Age? It has lately been the fashion to speak of the untenable conceptions of an uncultivated past, as though it were possible to hide behind an epigram the intellectual quarries out of which the reputations of so many modern philosophers have been carved. Just as Tyndall is ever ready to disparage ancient philosophers, for a dressing up of whose ideas more than one distinguished scientist has derived honor and credit, so the geologists seem more and more inclined to take for granted all of the archaic races were contemporaneously in a state of dense barbarism. But not all of our best authorities agree in this opinion. Some of the most eminent maintain exactly the reverse. Max Mueller, for instance, says, quote, "Many things are still unintelligible to us, and the hieroglyphic language of antiquity records but half of the mind's unconscious inventions. Yet more and more the image of man, in whatever clime we meet him, rises before us, noble and pure from the very beginning. Even his errors we learn to understand, even his dreams we begin to interpret. As far as we can trace back the footsteps of man, even on the lowest strata of history, we see the divine gift of a sound and sober intellect belonging to him from the very first, and the idea of a humanity emerging slowly from the depths of animal brutality can never be maintained again." End quote. As it is claimed to be unphilosophical to inquire into first causes, scientists now occupy themselves with considering their physical effects. The field of scientific investigation is therefore bounded by physical nature. When once its limits are reached, enquiry must stop, and their work can be recommenced. With all due respect to our learned men, they are like the squirrel upon its revolving wheel, for they are doomed to turn their matter over and over again. Science is a mighty potency, and it is not for us pygmies to question her. But the so-called scientists are not themselves science embodied, any more than the men of our planet are the planet itself. We have neither the right to demand nor power to compel our modern-day philosopher to accept without challenge a geographical description of the dark side of the moon. But if in some lunar cataclysm one of her inhabitants should be hurled thence into the attraction of our atmosphere, and land, safe and sound, at Dr. Carpenter's door, he would be indictable as recreant to professional duty if he should fail to set the physical problem at rest. For a man of science to refuse an opportunity to investigate any new phenomenon, whether it comes to him in the shape of a man from the moon or a ghost from some home, is reprehensible. Whether arrived at by the method of Aristotle or that of Plato, we need not stop to inquire. But it is a fact that both the inner and outer natures of man are claimed to have been thoroughly understood by the ancient peoples. Notwithstanding the superficial hypotheses of current geologists, we are beginning to have almost daily proofs in corroboration of the assertions of these ancient philosophers. They divided the interminably long periods of human existence on this planet into cycles, during each of which mankind gradually reached the culminating point of the highest civilization and then gradually relapsed into abject barbarism. To what eminence the race in its progress had several times arrived may be feebly surmised by the wonderful monuments of old, still visible, and the descriptions given by Herodotus of other marvels of which no traces now remain. Even in his days, the gigantic structures of many pyramids and world-famous temples were but masses of ruins, scattered by the unrelenting hands of time. They are described by the father of history as these venerable witnesses of the long bygone glory of departed ancestors. He shrinks from speaking of divine things and gives to posterity but an imperfect description from hearsay of some marvelous subterranean chambers of the labyrinth, where lie concealed the sacred remains of the king initiates of Egypt. We can judge, moreover, of the lofty civilization reached in some periods of antiquity by the historical descriptions of the ages of the Ptolemies. Yet in that epoch, the arts and sciences were considered to be degenerating already, and the secret of a number of the former had been already lost. In the recent excavations of Mariette Bay at the foot of the pyramids in Egypt, statues of wood and other relics have been exhumed, which show that long before the period of the first dynasties, the Egyptians had attained to a refinement and perfection which is calculated to excite the wonder of even the most ardent admirers of Grecian art. Bayard Taylor describes these statues in one of his lectures and tells us that the beauty of the heads, ornamented with eyes of precious stones and copper eyelids, is unsurpassed. Far below the stratum of sand in which lay the remains gathered into the collections of the British museums were found buried the tangible proofs of the Hermetic doctrine of cycles, which has already been explained. Dr. Schliemann, the enthusiastic Hellenist, has recently found in his excavations of the Troad abundant evidences of the same gradual change from barbarism to civilization, and from civilization to barbarism again and again. Why then should we feel so reluctant to admit the possibility that, if the antediluvians were so much better versed than ourselves in certain sciences as to have been perfectly acquainted with important arts, which we now term lost, that they might have equally excelled in psychological knowledge than we do now? Such a hypothesis must be considered as reasonable as any other until some countervailing evidence shall be discovered to destroy it. Every true savant admits that, in many respects, human knowledge is yet in its infancy. Can it be that our cycle began in ages comparatively recent? These cycles, according to the Chaldean philosophy, do not embrace all mankind at one and the same time. Professor Draper partially corroborates this view by saying that the periods into which geology has found it convenient to divide the progress of man in civilization are not abrupt epochs which hold good simultaneity for the whole human race, giving as example the wandering Indians of America, who are only at the present moment emerging from the Stone Age. Thus, more than one scientific man has unwittingly confirmed the testimony of the ancients. Any Kabbalist well acquainted with the Pythagorean system of numerals and geometry can demonstrate that the metaphysical views of Plato were based upon the strictest mathematical principles. True mathematics, it is written in Magicon, is something with which all higher sciences are connected. Common mathematics is but a deceitful phantasmagoria, whose much praised infallibility only arises from this, that materials, conditions, and references are made of its foundation. End quote. Scientists who believe that they have adopted the Aristotelian method only because they creep when they do not run from demonstrated particulars of universals, glorify this method of inductive philosophy and reject that of Plato, which they treat as unsubstantial. Professor Draper laments that such speculative mystics as Ammonius Saccas and Plotinus should have taken the place of the severe geometers of the old museum. He forgets that geometry, of all sciences, the only one which proceeds from universals to particulars, was precisely the method employed by Plato in his philosophy. As long as exact science confines its observations to physical conditions and proceeds Aristotle-like, it certainly cannot fail. But notwithstanding that the world of matter is boundless for us, it is still finite, and thus materialism will turn forever in its vitriated circle, unable to soar higher than the circumference will permit. the cosmological theory of numerals which Pythagoras learned from the Egyptian hierophants is alone able to reconcile the two units, matter and spirit, and causes each to demonstrate the other mathematically. The sacred numbers of the universe, in their esoteric combinations, solve the great problems and explains the theory of radiation and the cycle of the emanations. The lower orders, before they develop into higher ones, must emanate from the higher spiritual ones, and when arrived at the turning point, they must be reabsorbed again into the infinite. Physiology, like everything else in this world of constant evolution, is subject to the psychic revolution as well. As it now seems to be hardly emerging from the shadows of the lower arc, so it may be one day proved to have been at the highest point of the circumference of the circle far earlier than the days of Pythagoras. Mochus, the Sindonian, the physiologist and teacher of the science of anatomy, flourished long before the sage of Samos, and the latter received the sacred instructions from his disciples and descendants. Pythagoras, the pure philosopher, the deeply versed in profounder phenomena of nature, the noble inheritor of the ancient lore, whose great aim was to free the soul from the fetters of sense and force it to realize its powers, Pythagoras must live eternally in human memory. The impenetrable veil of arcane secrecy was thrown over the sciences taught in the sacred spaces of yore. This is the cause of the modern depreciation of the ancient philosophies. Even Plato and Philo-Judaeus have been accused by many a commentator for absurd inconsistencies, whereas the design which underlies the maze of metaphysical contradictions so perplexing to the readers of Timaeus is but too evident. And yet, has Plato ever been read understandingly by one of the expounders of the classics? This is a question warranted by the criticisms to be found in such authors as Stahlbaum, Schleiermacher, Ficinus, Heindorf, Sydenham, Buttman, Taylor, and Burgess, to say nothing of lesser authorities. The covert allusions of the Greek philosopher to esoteric things have manifestly baffled these commentators to the last degree. They not only, with unblushing coolness, suggest as to certain difficult passages that another phraseology was evidently intended, but they audaciously make the changes. The Orphic line, which goes, "Of the song, the order of the sixth race close," which can only be interpreted as a reference to the sixth race evolved in the consecutive evolution from the fifth. The man Burgess says, "This was evidently taken from a cosmogony where man was feigned to be created the last." Ought not one who undertakes to edit another's works at least understand what his author means? Indeed, the ancient philosophers seem to be generally held, even by the least prejudiced of our modern critics, to have lacked that profundity and thorough knowledge in the exact sciences of which our century is so boastful. It is even questioned whether they understood that basic scientific principle, ex nihilo nihil fit. If they suspected the indestructibility of matter at all, say these commentators, it was not in consequence of a firmly established formula, but only through an intuitional reasoning and by analogy. We hold to the contrary opinion. The speculations of these philosophers upon matter were open to public criticism, but their teachings in regard to spiritual things were profoundly esoteric. Being thus sworn to secrecy and religious silence upon abstruse subjects involving the relations of spirit and matter, they rivaled each other in their ingenuous methods for concealing their real opinions. The doctrine of metapsychosis has been abundantly ridiculed by men of science and rejected by theologians. Yet, if it had been properly understood in its application to the indestructibility of matter and the immortality of spirit, it would have been perceived that it is a sublime conception indeed. Should we not first regard the subject from the standpoint of the ancients before venturing to disparage its teachers modern day? The solution of the great problem of eternity belongs neither to religious superstition nor to gross materialism. The harmony and mathematical equiformity of the double evolution, spiritual and physical, are elucidated only in the universal numerals of Pythagoras, who built his system entirely upon the so-called metrical speech of the Hindu Vedas. It is but lately that one of the most zealous Sanskrit scholars, Martin Hogg, undertook the translation of the Brahma of the Rig Veda. It had been till that time entirely unknown. These explanations indicate beyond dispute the identity of the Pythagorean and Brahmanical systems. In both, the esoteric significance is derived from the number. In the former, from the mystic relation of every number to everything intelligible to the human mind. In the latter, from the number of syllables of which each verse in the mantras consists. Plato, the ardent disciple of Pythagoras, realized it so fully as to maintain that the dodecahedron was the geometrical figure employed by the demiurge in the construction of the universe. Some of these figures had a peculiarly solemn significance. For instance, the number 4, of which the dodecahedron is the trine, was held sacred by the Pythagoreans. It is, of course, the perfect square, and neither of the bounding lines exceeds the other in length by a single point. It is the emblem of moral justice and divine equity, geometrically expressed. All the powers and great symphonies of physical and spiritual nature lie inscribed within the perfect square. And the ineffable name of Him, which remains nameless, would remain unutterable, but it was replaced by this sacred number 4, the most binding and solemn oath with the ancient mystics. If the Pythagorean metempsychosis should be thoroughly explained and compared with the modern theory of evolution, it would be found to supply every missing link in the chain of the latter. But who of our scientists would consent to lose their precious time over the vagaries of the ancients? Notwithstanding proofs to the contrary, they not only deny that the notions of the archaic period, but even the ancient philosophers had any positive knowledge of the heliocentric system. The Venerable Bedes, the Augustines, and Lacanti appear to have smothered with their dogmatic ignorance all faith in the more ancient theologists of the pre-Christian centuries. But now philology and a closer acquaintance with Sanskrit literature have partially enabled us to vindicate them from these unmerited imputations. In the Vedas, for instance, we find positive proof that so long ago as 2,000 years before Christ, the Hindu sages and scholars must have been acquainted with the rotundity of our globe and the heliocentric system. Hence, Pythagoras and Plato knew well this astronomical truth, for Pythagoras obtained his knowledge in India, or from men who had been there, and Plato faithfully echoed it in his teachings. We will quote 2 passages from the Aitreya Brahmana. In the Serpent Mantra, the Brahmana declares as follows, that this mantra is the one which was seen by the queen of the serpents, Sarapa Rajni, because the earth is the queen of the serpents, as she is the mother and queen of all that moves. In the beginning, she, the earth, was but one head, meaning round, without hair, meaning without vegetation. She then perceived this mantra, which confers upon him who knows it the power of assuming any form which he might desire. She spoke the mantra, meaning sacrificed to the gods, and, in consequence, immediately obtained a motley appearance. She became variegated and able to produce any form she might like, changing one form into another. This mantra begins with the words, Ayam Gau Prisnir Akramit. End quote. The description of the earth in the shape of a round and bald head, which was potentially soft and malleable at first, and then became hard only from being breathed upon by the god Vayu, the Lord of Air, forcibly suggests the idea that the authors of the sacred Vedic books knew the earth to be round, meaning spherical. Moreover, that it had been a gelatinous mass at first, which gradually cooled off under the influence of the air and time. So much for their knowledge about our globe's circularity, and now we will present the testimony upon which we base our assertion that the Hindus were perfectly acquainted with the heliocentric system at least 2,000 years BC. In the same treatise, the Hotar, the priest, is taught how the Shastras should be repeated, and how the phenomenon of sunrise and sunset are to be explained. It says, "The one God who burns is the sun who never sets nor rises. When people think the sun is setting, it is not so. They are mistaken. For, after having arrived at the end of the day, it produces two opposite effects, making night to what is below and day to what is on the other side. When they, the people, believe it rises in the morning, the sun only does thus. Having reached the end of the night, it makes itself produce two opposite effects, making day to what is below and night to what is on the other side. In fact, the sun never sets, nor does it set for him who has such a knowledge." End quote. This statement is not so conclusive that even the translator of the Rig Veda, Dr. Haug, was forced to remark it. He says this passage contains the denial of the existence of sunrise and sunset, and that the author supposes the sun to always remain in its high position. In one of the earliest Niveds, Rishi Kusta, a Hindu sage of the remotest antiquity, explains the allegory of the first laws given to the celestial bodies. For doing what she ought not to do, Anahit, or Nana, the Persian Venus, representing the earth in this legend, is sentenced to turn around the sun for eternity. The satras, or sacrificial sessions, prove undoubtedly that so early as in the 18th or 20th centuries BC, the Hindus had made considerable progress in astronomical science. The satras, the sacrificial sessions, lasted 1 full year and were nothing but an imitation of the sun's yearly course. They were divided, says Haug, into 2 distinct parts, each consisting of 6 months of 30 days each. In the midst of both was the Vishuvan, equator or central day, cutting the 2 satas into 2 halves. The scholar Haug, although he ascribes the composition of the bulk of the Brahmanas to the period of 1400 to 1200 BC, is of the opinion that the oldest of the hymns may be placed at the very commencement of Vedic literature, between the years 2400 and 2000 BC. He finds no reason for considering the Vedas less ancient than the sacred books of the Chinese. As the Shu King, or Book of History, And the sacrificial songs of the Shi King, or Book of Odes, have been proved to have an antiquity as early as 2200 BC. Our philologists may yet be compelled before long to acknowledge that in astronomical knowledge, the antediluvian Hindus were their masters. At all events, there are facts which prove that certain astronomical calculations were as correct with the Chaldeans in the days of Julius Caesar as they are now. When the calendar was reformed by the conqueror, the civil year was found to correspond so little with the actual seasons that summer had merged into autumn months, and autumn months were fully in the middle of winter. It was a Chaldean astronomer, Sosigenes, who restored order into the confusion by putting back the 25th of March 90 days, thus making it correspond with the vernal equinox. And it was Sosigenes, again, who fixed the lengths of the months as they now remain 15 centuries later. In Central America, it was found by the Moctezuman army that the calendar of the Aztecs gave an equal number of days and weeks to each month. The extreme accuracy of their astronomical calculations was so great that no error has been discovered in their reckoning by subsequent verifications, while the Europeans who landed in Mexico in 1519 were, by the Julian calendar, nearly 11 days in advance of the exact time. It is to the priceless and accurate translations of the Vedic books and to the personal researches of Dr. Haug that we are indebted for the corroboration of the claims of the Hermetic philosophers. That the period of Zarathustra was of untold antiquity can be easily proved. The Brahmanas, to which Haug ascribes 4,000 years, describe the religious contest between the ancient Hindus who lived in the pre-Vedic period and the Iranians. The battles between the Devas and the Asuras, the former representing the Hindus and the latter the Iranians, are described at length in the sacred books. As the Iranian prophet was the first to raise himself against what he called the idolatry of the Brahmans, and to designate them as the Devas, or devils, how far back must then have been this religious crisis? This contest, answers Dr. Haug, must have appeared to the authors of the Brahmanas as old as the feats of King Arthur appears to English writers of the 19th century. There was not a philosopher of any notoriety who did not hold to his doctrine of the metapsychosis as taught by the Brahmans, the Buddhists, and later by Pythagoreans, in its esoteric sense, whether he expressed it more or less intelligibly. Origen and Clemens Alexandrinus, Synesius and Chaldeus all believed in it, and the Gnostics, who are unhesitatingly proclaimed by history as a body of the most refined, learned, and enlightened men, were all believers in metapsychosis. Socrates entertained opinions identical with those of Pythagoras, and both, as the penalty of their divine philosophy, were put to a violent death. The rabble has been the same in all ages. Materialism has been and will ever be blind to spiritual truths. These philosophers held, with the Hindus, that God had infused into matter a portion of his own divine spirit, which animates and moves every particle in existence. They taught that men have two souls of separate and quite different natures. The one is perishable, the astral soul, or inner fluidic body. The other is incorruptible and immortal, the portion of the divine spirit, that the mortal or astral soul perishes at each gradual change at the threshold of every new sphere, becoming with every transmigration of death of the body and rebirth more purified. The astral man, intangible and invisible as he might be to our mortal earthly senses, is still constituted of matter, though very sublimated. Aristotle, notwithstanding that for political reasons of his own he maintained a prudent silence as to certain esoteric matters, expressed very clearly his opinion on the subject. It was his belief that human souls are emanations of God, that are finally reabsorbed into divinity, losing all traces of selfhood. Zeno, the founder of the Stoics, taught that there are, quote, two eternal qualities throughout nature, the one active or male, the other passive or female, that the former is pure, subtle ether or divine spirit, the other entirely inert in itself, till united with the active principle. That the divine spirit acting upon matter produced fire, water, earth, and air, and that it is the sole efficient principle by which all of nature is moved. The Stoics, like the Hindu sages, believed in the final absorption. Saint Justin believed in the emanation of these souls from the divine, and Tatian, the Assyrian, his disciple, declared that humanity was as immortal as God himself. End quote. Then there is that profoundly significant verse of Genesis in the Bible saying, "And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, I gave a living soul." This quote should attest to the attention of every Hebrew scholar capable of reading. Hopefully they read the scripture in its original instead of following with the erroneous translations in which the phrase reads, "I gave life." From the first to the last chapters, the translators of the Jewish sacred books misconstrued these meanings. They have even changed the spellings of the name of God, as Sir W. Drummond proves. Thus, El, if written correctly, would read Al, for it stands in the original Al, and according to Higgins, this word means the god Mithra, the sun, the preserver and savior. Sir W. Drummond shows that Bethel means the house of the sun in its literal translation, and not of God. El, in the composition of these Canaanite names, does not signify Deus, but Sol, the sun god. Thus, theology has disfigured ancient theosophy, and science has disfigured ancient philosophy. For lack of comprehension of this great philosophical principle, the methods of modern science, however exact, must end in nullity. In no one branch can it demonstrate the origin and ultimate of things. Instead of tracing the effect from its primal source, its progress is the reverse. Its higher types, as it teaches, are all evolved from antecedent lower ones. It starts from the bottom of the cycle, led on step by step in the great labyrinth of nature by a thread of matter. As soon as this thread breaks and the clue is lost, it recoils in affright from the incomprehensible and confesses itself powerless. Not so did Plato and his disciples. With him, the lower types were but the concrete images of the higher abstract ones. The soul, which is immortal, has a mathematical, as the body has geometrical, beginning. This beginning, as a reflection of the great universal archeus, is self-moving, and from the center diffuses itself over the whole body of the microcosm. It was the sad perception of this truth that made Tyndall confess how powerless is science, even over the world of matter. He says, "The first marshalling of the atoms, on which all subsequent action depends, baffles a keener power than that of the microscope. Through pure excess of complexity, and long before observation can have any voice in the matter, the most highly trained intellect, the most refined and disciplined imagination, retires in bewilderment from the contemplation of the problem. We are struck dumb by an astonishment which no microscope can relieve, doubting not only the power of our instrument, but even whether we ourselves possess the intellectual elements which will ever enable us to grapple with the ultimate structure of the universe." End quote. The fundamental geometrical figure of the Kabbalah, that figure which tradition and the esoteric doctrines tell us was given by the deity itself to Moses on Mount Sinai, contains in its grandiose but simple combination the key to this universal problem. This figure contains within itself all the others. For those who are able to master it, there is no need to exercise imagination. No earthly microscope could ever be compared with the keenness of spiritual perception. And even for those who are unacquainted with the great science, the description given by a well-trained child psychometer of the genesis of grain, a fragment of crystal or any other physical object, is worth all the telescopes and microscopes of the so-called exact science. There may be more truth in the adventurous pangenesis of Darwin, whom Tyndall calls a soaring speculator, than in the cautious, line-bound hypotheses of the latter, who, in common with other thinkers of his class, surrounds his imagination by the firm frontiers of reason. The theory of a microscopic germ which contains in itself a world of minor germs soars, in one sense at least, into the infinite. It oversteps the world of matter and begins unconsciously busying itself in the world of spirit. If we accept Darwin's theory of the development of the species, we find that his starting point is placed in front of an open door. We are at liberty with him to either remain within or cross the threshold beyond which lies the limitless and the incomprehensible, or rather the unutterable. If our mortal language is inadequate to express what our spirit dimly foresees in the great beyond while on this earth, it must realize it at some point in the timeless eternity. Not so with Professor Huxley's theory of physical basis of life. Regardless of the formidable majority of nays from his German brother scientists, he creates a universal protoplasm and appoints its cells to become henceforth the sacred founts of the principle of all life. By making the latter identical in living man, dead mutton, a nettle sting, and a lobster, by shutting in the molecular cell of the protoplasm the life principle, and by shutting out from it the divine influx which comes with subsequent evolution, he closes every door against any possible escape. Like an able tactician, he converts his laws and facts into sentries, whom he causes to mount guard over every issue. The standard under which he rallies them is inscribed with the word necessity. But hardly is it unfurled when he mocks the legend and calls it an empty shadow of my own imagination. The fundamental doctrines on spiritualism, he says, lie beyond the limits of philosophical inquiry. Will we be bold enough to contradict this assertion and say that they lie a great deal more within such inquiry than Mr. Huxley's protoplasm? Insomuch that they present evident and palpable facts of the existence of spirit, and the protoplasmic cells, once dead, present none whatever of the being of the originators or the basis of life, as this one of the few foremost thinkers of the day wants us to believe. The ancient Kabbalist rested upon no hypothesis till he could lay its basis upon the firm rock of recorded experiment. But the two great dependents upon physical facts led to a growth of materialism and a decadence of spirituality and faith. Even by the time of Aristotle, this was the prevailing tendency of thought. And though the Delphic commandment was not as yet completely eliminated from Grecian thought, and some philosophers still held that in order to know what man is, we ought to know what man was, still materialism had already begun to gnaw at the root of faith 2,500 years ago. The mysteries themselves had degenerated in a very great degree into mere priestly speculations and religious fraud. Few were the true adepts and initiates, the heirs and descendants of those who had been dispersed by the conquering swords of various invaders of old Egypt. The time predicted by the great Hermes had indeed come. The time when imperious foreigners would accuse Egypt of adoring monsters, and nothing but the glyphs engraved in stone upon her monuments would survive. Their sacred scribes and hierophants were wanderers upon the face of the earth. Obliged from fear of a profanation of the sacred mysteries to seek refuge among the Hermetic fraternities, later known as the Essenes, their esoteric knowledge was buried deeper than ever. The triumphant brand of Aristotle's pupil swept away from his path of conquest every vestige of a once pure religion. And Aristotle himself, the type and child of his epoch, though instructed in the secret science of the Egyptians, knew but little of this crowning result of millenniums of esoteric studies. As well as those who lived in the days of the Sametrics, our present-day philosophers lift the veil of Isis, for Isis is merely the symbol of nature to them. But they only saw her in physical forms. The soul within escapes their view, and the Divine Mother has no answers to them. There are anatomists who, uncovering to sight no indwelling spirit under the layers of muscles, the network of nerves, or the sinews, or the curvaceous brain which they lift with the point of their scalpel, they assert that man has no visible soul, so it therefore does not exist. Such are the pure blind in sophistry, as the same student who, confining his research to the cold letter of the Kabbalah, dares to say it has no vivifying spirit. To see the true man who once inhabited the subject which lies before him on the dissecting table, dead, the surgeon must use other eyes than those of his body. So the glorious truth covered up in the hieretical writings of the ancient papyrus can be revealed only to him who possesses the faculty of intuition, which, if we call reason the eye of the mind, may also be defined as the eye of the soul. Intuition is the eye of the soul. Our modern science acknowledges a supreme power, the invisible principle, but denies a supreme being or personal God. Logically, the difference between the two might be questioned, for in this case, the power and the being are identical. Human reason can hardly imagine to itself an intelligent supreme power without associating it with the idea of an intelligent supreme being. The masses can never be expected to have a clear conception of the omnipotence and omnipresence of a supreme God, without investing with those attributes a gigantic projection of their own personality. But the Kabbalists have never looked upon the invisible Sophia otherwise than as a power. So far, our modern positivists have been anticipated by thousands of ages in their cautious philosophy. What the Hermetic adept claims to demonstrate is that simple common sense precludes the possibility that this universe is the result of mere chance. Such an idea appears to him more absurd than to think that the problems of Euclid were unconsciously formed by a monkey playing with geometrical figures. Very few Christians understand, if indeed they know anything at all, of the Jewish theology. Even the book, the Talmud, is the darkest of enigmas for most Jews, while those Hebrew scholars who do comprehend it do not boast or teach their knowledge. Their Kabbalistic books are still less understood by them, for in our days more Christian than Jewish students are engrossed in the elimination of their great truths. How much less is definitely known of the Oriental or the Universal Kabbalah? Its adepts are few. But these heirs elect of the sages who discovered the starry truths which shone on the great chimeria of the Chaldean lore have solved the absolute and are now resting from their grand labor. They cannot go beyond that which is given to mortals of this earth to know. And no one, not even these elect, can trespass beyond the line drawn by the finger of the divinity itself. Travelers have met these adepts on the shores of the sacred Ganges, brushed against them in the silent ruins of Thebes, and in the mysterious deserted chambers of Luxor. Within the halls upon whose blue and golden vaults the weird signs attract attention, but whose secret meaning is never penetrated by the idle gazers, they have been seen but seldom recognized. Historical memoirs have recorded their presence in the brilliantly illuminated salons of European aristocracy. They have been encountered again on the arid and desolate plains of the Great Sahara, as in the caves of Elephanta. They may be found elsewhere, but make themselves known only to those who have devoted their lives to unselfish study and are not likely to turn back. Maimonides, the great Jewish theologian and historian, who at one time was almost deified by his countrymen and afterward treated as a heretic, remarks that the more absurd and void of sense the Talmud seems, the more sublime is the secret meaning. This learned man, Maimonides, has successfully demonstrated that the Chaldean magic, the science of Moses and other learned students, was wholly based on an extensive knowledge of the various and now forgotten branches of natural science. thoroughly acquainted with all the resources of the vegetable, animal, and mineral kingdoms, experts in occult chemistry and physics, psychologists as well as physiologists, why wonder that the graduates or adepts, instructed in the mysterious sanctuaries of the temples, could perform wonderful magic, which even in our days of enlightenment would appear supernatural? It is an insult to human nature to brand magic and the occult science with the name of imposture. To believe that for so many thousands of years, one half of mankind practiced deception and fraud on the other half is equivalent to saying that the human race was composed only of knaves and incurable idiots. Where is the country in which magic was not practiced? At what age was it wholly forgotten? The oldest documents now in our possession, the Rig Vedas, and the older laws of Manu, we find many magical rites practiced and permitted in the Brahmans. Tibet, Japan, and China teach in the present age that which was taught by the oldest Chaldeans. The clergy of these respective countries prove moreover what they teach, namely, that the practice of moral and physical purity and of certain austerities develops the vital soul power of self-illumination, affording to man the control over his own immortal spirit. It gives him truly magical powers over the elementary spirits inferior to himself. In the West we find magic of as high an antiquity as in the East. The Druids of Great Britain practiced magic in the silent crypts of their deep caves. And Pliny devotes many a chapter to the wisdom of the leaders of the Celts. The Druids and the Gauls expounded the physical as well as the spiritual sciences. They taught the secrets of the universe, the harmonious progress of the heavenly bodies, the formations of the earth, and above all, they taught the immortality of the soul. Into their sacred groves, natural academies, built by the hand of the invisible architect, the initiates assembled at the still hour of midnight to learn about what man once was and what he will be. They needed no artificial illumination, no life-drawing gas or electricity to light up their temples, for the chaste goddess of night beamed her most silvery rays upon their oak-crowned heads, and their white-robed sacred clothing knew how to converse with the solitary queen of the starry vault. On the dead soil of the long bygone past stand their sacred oaks, now dried up and stripped of their spiritual meaning by the venomous breath of materialism. But for the student of occult learning, their vegetation is still as verdant and luxuriant, and as full of deep and sacred truths, as at that hour when the arch-druid performed his magical cures thousands of years ago, and waving the branch of mistletoe severed with his golden sickle the green bough from its mother oak tree. Magic is as old as humanity. It is as impossible to name the time when magic sprang into existence as to indicate on precisely what day the first human was born. Whenever a writer has started with the idea of connecting its first foundation in a country with some historical character, further research has proved his views groundless. Odin, the Scandinavian priest and monarch, was thought by many to have originated the practice of magic some 70 years BC. But it was easily demonstrated that the mysterious rites of the priestesses, called volières or valas, were greatly anterior to this age. Some modern authors were bent on proving that Zoroaster was the founder of magic because he was the founder of the Magian religion. Other historians demonstrated conclusively that Zoroaster was but a reformer of magic, as practiced by the Chaldeans and Egyptians. The greatest teachers of divinity agree that nearly all ancient books were written symbolically and in a language intelligible only to the initiated using their intuition. The biographical sketch of Apollonius of Tyana affords an example. As every Kabbalist knows, it embraces the whole of the Hermetic philosophy, being a counterpart in many respects of the traditions left us by King Solomon. It reads like a fairy tale, but, as in the case of the latter, sometimes facts and historical events are presented to the world under the colors of fiction. The journey to India represents allegorically the trials of a neophyte. His long discourses with the Brahmans, their sage advice, and the dialogues with the Corinthian Menippus would, if interpreted, give the esoteric catechism. His visit to the empire of the wise men, his interview with their king Hierarchus, the oracle of Amphiaraus, explain symbolically many of the secret dogmas of Hermes. They would disclose, if understood, some of the most important secrets of nature. Eliphas Levi points out the great resemblance which exists between King Hierarchus and the fabulous Hiram, of whom Solomon procured the cedars of Lebanon and the gold of Ophir. We would like to know whether modern Freemasons, even their grand lecturers, and their most intelligent craftsmen belonging to important lodges, understand who the Hiram is, and whose death they combine together to avenge. Putting aside the purely metaphysical teachings of the Kabbalah, if one would devote himself but to physical occultism, to the so-called branch of therapeutics, the results might benefit some of our modern sciences, such as chemistry and medicine. Says Professor Draper, sometimes, not without surprise, we meet with ideas which we flatter ourselves originated in our own times." End quote. This remark, uttered in relation to the scientific writings, would apply still better to the more secret treatises of the ancients. Modern medicine, while it has gained largely in anatomy, physiology, and pathology, and even in therapeutics, has lost immensely by its narrowness of spirit, its rigid materialism, its sectarian dogmatism. One school, in its pure blindedness, sternly ignores whatever is developed by other schools, and yet all unite in ignoring every grand conception of humanity or nature developed by mesmerism or by psychological experiments on the brain. Every principle which does not conform to materialism. It would require a convocation of the hostile physicians of the several different schools to bring together what is now known of medical science. And it too often happens that after the best practitioners have vainly exhausted their art upon a patient, a mesmerist or a healing medium will be the one to effect a cure. The explorers of old medical literature, from the time of Hippocrates to that of Paracelsus and even Van Helmont, will find a vast number of well-attested physiological and psychological facts and of measures of medicines for healing the sick, which modern physicians superciliously refuse to employ. Even with respect to surgery, modern practitioners have humbly and publicly confessed the total impossibility of their approximating to anything like the marvelous skilled display in the art of bandaging by ancient Egyptians. The many hundred yards of ligature enveloping a mummy from its ears down to every separate toe were studied by the chief surgical operators recently in Paris, and, notwithstanding that the models were right in front of their eyes, they were unable to accomplish anything like it. In the Abbott Egyptological Condition in New York City, it may be seen numerous evidences of the skill of the ancients in various handicrafts, among others the art of lace making. And, as it could hardly be expected but that the signs of a woman's vanity should go side by side with those of a man's strength, there are also specimens of artificial hair and gold ornaments of various types. The New York paper The Tribune, reviewing again the contents of Eber's papyrus, says, "Verily, there is no new thing under the sun." Chapters 65, 66, 79, and 89 show that hair invigorators for men, hair dyes for men and women, painkillers, and flea powders were being used 3,400 years ago in Egypt. How few of our recent alleged discoveries are in reality new, and how many belonged to the ancients. This is again fairly and eloquently, though but in part stated by our eminent philosophical writer, Professor John W. Draper. His book, The Conflict Between Science and Religion, a great book with a bad title, swarms with such facts. In page 13, he cites a few of the achievements of ancient philosophers, which excited the admiration of Greece. In Babylon was a series of Chaldean astronomical observations ranging back through 1903 years, which Callisthenes sent to Aristotle. Ptolemy, the Egyptian astronomer king, possessed a Babylonian record of eclipses going back 747 years before that era. As Professor Draper truly remarks, long continued and close observations were necessary before some of these astronomical results that have reached our times could have been ascertained. Thus, the Babylonians had fixed the length of a tropical year within 25 seconds of truth. Their estimate of the sidereal year was barely 2 minutes in excess. They had detected the precession of the equinoxes. They knew the causes of eclipses, and by the aid of their cycle, they could predict them. Their estimate of the value of that cycle, which is more than 6,585 days, was in 19.5 minutes of precise. End quote. Such facts furnish incontrovertible proof of the patience and skill with which astronomy had been cultivated in Mesopotamia, and that, with very inadequate instrumental means, it had reached no inconsiderable perfection. These old observers had made a catalogue of the stars. They had divided the zodiac into 12 signs. They had parted the day into 12 hours and the night into 12 hours. They had, as Aristotle says, for a long time devoted themselves to observations of star movements in relation to the moon. They had correct views of the structure of the solar system and knew the order of emplacement of the planets. They constructed sundials, astrolabes, and gnomons. Speaking of the world of eternal truths that lies within the world of transient delusions and unrealities, Professor Draper says, quote, "That world is not to be discovered through a vain tradition that have brought down to us the opinion of men who lived in the morning of civilization, nor in the dreams of mystics who thought they were inspired. It is to be discovered by the investigations of geometry and by the practical interrogations of nature." End quote. Precisely, the issue could not be better stated. This eloquent writer tells us a profound truth. He does not, however, tell us the whole truth, because he does not know it. He has not described the nature or extent of the knowledge imparted in the mysteries. No subsequent people has been so proficient in geometry as the builders of the pyramids in Egypt and other titanic monuments, antediluvian or post-diluvian. On the other hand, none has ever equaled them in practical interrogation of nature. An undeniable proof of this is the significance of their countless symbols. Every one of these symbols is an embodied idea, combining the conception of the divine invisible with the earthly and visible. The former is derived from the latter strictly through analogy according to the Hermetic formula, as above, so below. Their symbols show great knowledge of natural sciences and a practical study of cosmic power.